two massive worlds, two very different stories. One speaks in whispers of decay and loss, the other hums with the promise of adventure and rebirth. Elden Ring and The Legend of Zelda represent two fundamentally opposed philosophies about how to tell stories through landscape, architecture, and the spaces between words. Both games trust their players to read meaning into ruins, to understand history through debris, to feel emotion in the curve of a road or the shadow of a tower. But what those ruins say, and how they say it, couldn't be more different. Environmental storytelling has become one of gaming's most powerful narrative tools. It's the art of letting worlds speak for themselves, of embedding meaning into every stone, every weapon, every scattered corpse. It's archaeology as gameplay, where players become detectives piecing together what happened before they arrived. Both Elden Ring and Breath of the Wild have mastered this technique, but they've taken it in opposite emotional directions. One world died in fire and madness, still rotting under a broken sky. The other died a century ago and is already healing, already rebuilding, already remembering what hope feels like. This isn't just about different aesthetics. It's about two complete philosophies of what adventure means, what exploration should feel like, what ruins should teach us about ourselves. Zelda's Hyrule invites you to save something that still has life left in it. Elden Ring's lands. Between asks you to decide whether anything this broken deserves saving at all. One game believes in renewal. The other questions whether renewal is even possible when corruption runs this deep. Understanding how these two giants approach storytelling reveals something essential about game design, about hope and despair, about how we use fantasy worlds to process our own relationship with decay and resilience. FromSoftware's brutal landscapes carry the weight of irrecoverable loss, every structure a monument to failure, every NPC a ghost of someone who tried and fell short. Nintendo's Hyrule, by contrast, frames destruction as temporary, survivable, even beautiful in its own tragic way. The ruins there feel peaceful, not malevolent. They suggest that good things once existed, and good things might exist again. These aren't just mechanical differences in quest design or enemy placement. They're entire worldviews expressed through architecture, colour, light, and the stories that item descriptions whisper when you're willing to listen. They represent two answers to the same question. When everything has fallen apart, what do the pieces tell us? Can we read hope in rubble? Should we? And what does it mean when a game refuses to offer us that comfort? The way these games handle their broken worlds matters because environmental storytelling is ultimately about trust. It trusts players to pay attention, to interpret, to care enough about spaces to ask why they're shaped the way they are. It trusts that showing will always be more powerful than telling, that walking through a ruined throne room teaches more about kingship than any history book. And it trusts that we'll understand the difference between a world that died with dignity and one that's still writhing in its own corruption. Environmental storytelling operates on a simple principle. The world itself is the narrator. Instead of exposition dumps or lengthy dialogue trees, the landscape, architecture, object placement, and visual design communicate narrative directly to observant players. It's show-don't-tell taken to its logical extreme, where showing is the only option available because there's often no one left alive to do the telling. This approach has deep roots in game design, but it reached new sophistication with games like Dark Souls, which proved players would willingly piece together fragmented narratives if the fragments themselves were interesting enough. Environmental storytelling asks players to become archaeologists, historians, and detectives simultaneously. That half-buried sword tells a story. Those scorch marks on the wall tell a story. The position of corpses, the type of debris, The angle of collapsed architecture, all of it speaks if you learn the language. What makes this technique powerful is how it engages a different kind of attention than traditional storytelling. When an NPC tells you the kingdom fell, you process information. When you walk through the fallen kingdom yourself, noting the defensive positions that failed, the siege equipment that wasn't enough, the throne room with its roof blown open to the sky, you experience the fall. You don't just know it happened. You feel the weight of it in your chest as you climb over rubble that was once someone's home. The technique relies heavily on visual language and symbolic architecture. A cathedral built tall and bright speaks to different values than one built low and fortified. A civilization that builds with gold and glass has different priorities than one that builds with iron and stone. When those civilizations fall, the ruins themselves become historical documents. You can read ambition in the height of a tower, paranoia in the thickness of walls, desperation in hastily erected barricades. Environmental storytelling also depends on the player's willingness to engage. It's entirely possible to run through these worlds without reading a single environmental story, treating ruins as mere obstacles or backdrops. But for players who slow down, who look at placement and patterns, who ask, "Why is this here?" the technique offers something traditional narrative can't: the satisfaction of discovery. You weren't told the story. You found it. You earned it through attention and curiosity. This creates a unique player-narrative relationship. The story doesn't exist separate from exploration. It is exploration. Movement through space becomes narrative comprehension. The further you travel, the more you understand. The more you observe, the deeper the story becomes. And because interpretation is required, no two players experience quite the same narrative. Your Hyrule might emphasize different stories than mine. Your reading of the lands between might focus on threads I never noticed. The implicit versus explicit spectrum also matters here. Some environmental storytelling is direct. A corpse clutching a specific item in a specific place tells a clear story. But much of it is suggestive, requiring players to draw their own conclusions. Those statues missing their heads could mean religious persecution, or iconoclasm, or simple decay. The game won't tell you which. You decide based on context, other clues, and your own interpretation of what makes narrative sense. This ambiguity is a feature, not a bug. It allows for mystery, for multiple readings, for players to bring their own experiences and assumptions to the interpretation. It also allows game worlds to feel genuinely ancient and lived in, because real archaeology is exactly this ambiguous. We find pieces, we make educated guesses, but we're often wrong about what actually happened. Environmental storytelling in games mirrors this uncertainty, creating spaces that feel genuinely historical rather than obviously constructed. The technique also allows for pacing that respects player agency. Traditional cutscenes interrupt gameplay to deliver story. Environmental storytelling lets players control the pace of revelation. Want to rush through to the next boss? You can. Want to spend an hour reading every item description and examining every environmental detail? That's valid too. The story reveals itself at whatever speed you're willing to move through the world. The Legend of Zelda has always understood something fundamental about adventure. It should feel like joy, even when it's tinged with sadness. Breath of the Wild's Hyrule is a post-apocalyptic world. Make no mistake, Calamity Ganon destroyed this kingdom a century ago. Guardians turned against their creators. Castles fell. Champions died. The princess has been holding back malice itself for 100 years, while the hero slept in a resurrection shrine. This world ended. But that's not how it feels when you step out onto the Great Plateau for the first time. It feels like dawn. The sky is soft blue and gold. Grass sways in the wind. Deer graze peacefully in meadows. Ancient ruins stand covered in flowering vines, their stone weathered but not hostile. The world is quiet, yes, and empty in places, but it's not dead. It's resting. It's healing. It's waiting for someone to remember what it used to be. This is the essential philosophy of Zelda's environmental storytelling. Destruction is survivable, history is recoverable, and hope is always justified. The ruins of Hyrule Castle loom in the distance, wrapped in Ganon's malice, but they loom as a challenge, not as an indictment. They say, you can fix this rather than you caused this. They frame adventure as restoration, exploration as an act of healing. Nintendo's designers made deliberate choices to communicate this optimism. The color palette of Breath of the Wild leans toward brightness even in decay. Ruins are bathed in golden afternoon light. Moss and vines reclaim stone in ways that look gentle rather than consuming. Even the guardians, those ancient killing machines, rust picturesquely in fields where flowers now grow. Nature isn't depicted as reclaiming human spaces with violence. It's depicted as patiently weaving them back into itself, creating something new from what was broken. The spatial design reinforces this philosophy constantly. High viewpoints don't just offer tactical advantages, they offer vistas of breathtaking beauty. The game wants you to stop and look, to appreciate that this world, broken as it is, still contains wonder. Climbing a mountain isn't just about reaching the shrine at the top. It's about the view from halfway up, the way sunset lights the valleys below. The reminder that beauty persists even in catastrophe. The ruins themselves tell specific kinds of stories. Hyrule Castle's environmental storytelling focuses on last stands and heroic defense. You find weapons where soldiers made their final defenses, shields raised against enemies we can only imagine now. But those defensive positions read as brave rather than futile. The architecture suggests that people fought well, that they held longer than anyone expected, that courage meant something even in defeat. The Sheikah technology scattered across Hyrule also carries this hopeful framework. Ancient shrines weren't built for war, they were built for trial and growth. The champion's divine beasts were protectors, not weapons. Even when that technology was corrupted and turned against Hyrule, the game frames it as tragic rather than monstrous. These were tools meant to help, subverted by evil, but not evil themselves. The environmental story they tell is about innovation, hope, and the risk of trusting too much in our own cleverness, but not about the fundamental corruption of creation itself. Compare this to how the game handles its villages and settlements. Each of the surviving communities, Kakariko, Hateno, Rito Village, Goron City, Gerudo Town, Zora's Domain, exists as proof that civilization endures. These aren't desperate survivor camps, they're thriving towns with culture, commerce, tradition, and personality. Yes, they're smaller than they used to be. Yes, they remember losses. But they're building, not just surviving, they're looking forward, not just backward. The way NPCs interact with ruins also reveals this philosophy. When characters talk about the past, they speak with nostalgia and determination rather than despair. The old man on the Great Plateau mourns what was lost but still tends his fire and cooks his meals. Impa, ancient guardian of history, preserves memories not to wallow in them but to ensure the future knows what to rebuild. Zelda herself, glimpsed in memories, fights not because she thinks she'll win, but because fighting is what heroes do. The environmental message is clear, loss is real, but resignation is not inevitable. The game's approach to exploration also embodies this adventurous optimism. Discovering new locations in Breath of the Wild feels like uncovering secrets rather than trespassing in graveyards. Ancient shrines aren't tombs, they're puzzle boxes left by the Shaika as tests and gifts. Korok seeds hidden across the landscape turn exploration into a playful treasure hunt. Even the dragons, ancient beings of immense power, aren't hostile unless provoked. They soar through Hyrule as guardians, not as threats. This creates a fundamentally different emotional texture than many post-apocalyptic games. Where other ruined worlds communicate despair and inevitability, Hyrule communicates resilience and possibility. The world ended, but people survived. The hero fell, but he wakes again. The princess holds back darkness for 100 years because she believes someone will eventually come. This isn't naive, it's mythic. It's the structure of legend, where heroes always have one more chance and evil can be defeated even when it seems unkillable. The game's memory system also reflects this philosophy. Link lost his memories when he nearly died, and recovering them is optional but meaningful. Each memory shows moments of connection, courage, or growth. Some are painful, showing failure and loss, but they're framed as part of a larger story of determination. Zelda struggled with her powers and her place in the world. The champions faced their doubts. Link himself wasn't always the silent hero. But they all kept trying, and their trying matters even though they lost. What makes this philosophy powerful is how thoroughly it's woven into every aspect of the environmental design. It's not just that NPCs say hopeful things, it's that the world itself is structured to reward curiosity with beauty, to frame difficulty as challenge rather than punishment, to suggest that paying attention to the past helps you build a better future. When you find a Korok under a rock, the little creature laughs with joy at being found. When you complete a shrine, the monk inside thanks you and literally gives you a gift. The environmental language is consistently one of welcome, even in hostile areas. The game also understands something crucial about adventure. It should feel like you're discovering, not just processing information. The towers that reveal map sections don't just fill in cartography. They create moments of visual revelation where you suddenly see how regions connect, where landmarks are, what paths might be worth exploring. The Shaker Slate abilities, bombs, stasis, magnesis, cryonis, aren't just tools. They're invitations to experiment with the environment, to see what's possible, to approach problems creatively. This experimental ethos extends to combat and progression as well. Finding new weapons in Breath of the Wild feels like discovery rather than grinding. Spotting a shrine on a distant mountainside creates a personal goal you set for yourself. Even the game's much-discussed weapon degradation system, controversial as it is, forces experimentation and adaptability, rather than allowing you to settle into comfortable routines. The environmental design constantly pushes you toward trying new things, exploring new areas, approaching problems from unexpected angles. If Breath of the Wild is sunrise over healing ruins, Elden Ring is midnight in a graveyard where the corpses won't stay buried. FromSoftware's approach to environmental storytelling comes from a completely different philosophical place. The lands between didn't just fall, they rotted, they corrupted, they transformed into something that's still actively hostile to existence itself. This isn't a world recovering from catastrophe. This is a world where catastrophe is the new natural state. The first thing you notice in Elden Ring is the wrongness. The sky is too grey. The grass, where it exists, looks sickly. Trees twist in unnatural shapes. Even the architecture feels diseased, towers leaning at angles that suggest not just age but malevolence. as if the stone itself has given up on standing straight. This is deliberate. FromSoftware wants you to understand immediately that you're not here to save anything. You're here to witness the end stages of something that probably shouldn't have existed in the first place. The colour palette tells the story of a world that's moved beyond mere death into something worse. Limgrave, the starting area, still has some green, but it's the green of moss on corpses, of plants that thrive on rot. As you progress through the lands between, each region showcases a different kind of corruption. Caelid is actively rotting, its red sky and scarlet rot transforming everything into mutated horror. The mountaintops of the giants are frozen in perpetual blizzard, nature itself locked in suffering. Even the capital city of Lindel, seat of power for the Golden Order, is half burned and crawling with omens that the old regime tried to exterminate. FromSoftware's environmental storytelling operates on a principle of accumulated dread. Every discovery makes things worse. Every piece of lore you uncover reveals another layer of corruption, another betrayal, another good intention that curdled into nightmare. The Erd Tree, which should be the game's beacon of hope, looms over everything as a reminder of a lie that an entire civilization built itself around. The Golden Order that was supposed to bring eternal life and perfection instead created stagnation, suffering, and monsters. The ruins in Elden Ring don't suggest heroic last stands, they suggest inevitability. Castles fell because their defenders were always going to fall. Forts crumbled because they were built on rotten foundations from the beginning. Churches stand empty because the gods they served were either mad, dead, or worse. The environmental narrative is relentlessly pessimistic. Everyone who tried failed, and trying harder just means a more spectacular failure. Architecture in the lands between is a language of power and its abuse. Stormvale Castle, the first legacy dungeon most players encounter, is a maze of defensive positions that ultimately couldn't defend anything. Its design communicates paranoia, with overlapping fields of fire, hidden passages, and defensive layers that suggest Godric the Grafted knew. Enemies would come and knew all his preparations would fail anyway. The castle isn't just aged, it's rotting from the inside, infected with Godric's grafting experiments and his desperate attempts to become something greater than he was. Each region in Elden Ring has its own environmental horror story. Liurnia of the Lakes shows what happens when intellectual pursuit becomes obsession. The Academy of Raya Lucaria, once a seat of glintstone sorcery and learning, is now filled with mad scholars and students who literally had their faces melted by their own magic. The environmental design shows experiments gone wrong, classrooms turned into torture chambers, and a progression from knowledge to madness that feels inevitable once you understand what they were trying to achieve. Caelid is perhaps the game's most powerful piece of environmental storytelling. This region was destroyed by Malenia's scarlet rot during her battle with Radahn, and it's still actively dying. The sky is permanently red. The ground has turned into diseased flesh in places. Dogs are rabid and mutated beyond recognition. The environmental message is clear. Some destruction cannot be recovered from. Some wounds don't heal. They fester. Nature here isn't reclaiming the land. It's being consumed by something that shouldn't exist, that violates the basic principles of life itself. The game uses enemy placement as environmental storytelling constantly. Soldiers aren't just there for combat. Their positions tell you what they were defending, what they were afraid of, where they expected attack to come from. The fact that they're all dead or hollowed tells you their defense failed. Groups of corpses tell stories of battles, betrayals, or simple exhaustion. The lands between are littered with military architecture that didn't matter, defensive positions that didn't hold, last stands that nobody remembers. FromSoftware also excels at environmental storytelling through scale and verticality. The Erdtree dominates the skyline from everywhere, a constant reminder of the divine order that's now broken. Climbing toward it feels like ascending toward judgment rather than salvation. The underground areas, Siofra River and Ainsel River, reveal entire civilizations that existed before the Golden Order and were buried beneath it, suggesting that the current world's problems aren't new. They're cyclical, a pattern of rise and fall that's been happening forever. The game's approach to decay is particularly sophisticated. Things don't just age in Elden Ring, they transform. Nobles become grafted abominations, knights become tree men, scholars become crystalline horrors. The environmental design constantly shows transformation as corruption, change as degradation. This is a world where evolution is devolution, where trying to become more makes you less, where every attempt to transcend human limitation ends in horror. The legacy dungeons tell the most complete environmental stories. Stormvale is about desperate grasping for power. Raya Lucaria is about knowledge curdling into madness. Lendel is about the rot at the centre of supposed perfection. Crumbling Fara Mazula exists outside time itself, showing that even gods and dragons couldn't escape entropy. Each dungeon is a complete statement about what happens when ambition meets corruption, when power concentrates long enough to turn rotten. The game's NPC questlines reinforce this environmental pessimism. Nearly every character you meet is doomed. Their stories end in death, madness, or worse. And the environmental design supports this. You'll find their corpses later, positioned to tell you exactly how they died and how little it mattered. Rogier dies slowly in Round Table Hold, his body visible in its decline. Millicent's journey takes her back to the scarlet rot that's always been part of her. Bled, loyal wolf warrior, ends up exactly where prophecy said he would, no matter how hard he fought against it. What makes this effective isn't just grimness for its own sake. It's how thoroughly the environmental design commits to showing systems of power as fundamentally corrupting. The Golden Order created demigods who immediately started killing each other over scraps of the Elden Ring. The Outer Gods offer power that transforms believers into monsters. The merchants who dared exist outside the system were buried alive in a sewer. Every structure, every ruin, every corpse arrangement tells some variation on the same story. Power corrupts, ambition destroys, and trying to change things just makes them worse. The game's use of light also communicates this philosophy. Where Breath of the Wild bathes ruins in golden sunlight, Elden Ring keeps most of its world in perpetual overcast. The light that does exist often comes from sickly sources. The green glow of Deathroot, the red malevolence of scarlet rot, the pale luminescence of underground fungus. Even the grace sites, which should be beacons of hope, cast a light that's more exhausted than inspiring, as if even divine guidance is running out of energy. Both games understand that buildings aren't just spaces, they're statements. Architecture in these worlds functions as frozen history, solidified intention, physical manifestation of the values and fears of those who built them. But the buildings speak very different languages depending on which game you're in. Hyrule's architecture, even in ruins, communicates ambition and grace. The castle is enormous but not oppressive. The shrines are mysterious but welcoming. The divine beasts are massive but elegant. Even the ancient technology scattered across the landscape has a kind of Art Nouveau refinement to it. All curves and blue light and geometric precision, that suggest builders who valued beauty as much as function. The spaces are designed to inspire awe, not fear. The Shaker shrines are particularly good examples of architecture as narrative. Each shrine is a self-contained puzzle chamber that teaches players about the game's physics and mechanics, but they're also historical artifacts. The monks inside chose to mummify themselves centuries ago to maintain these trial chambers for a hero who might never come. The environmental story each shrine tells is about dedication, faith in prophecy, and the belief that preparation matters even across centuries. Hyrule Castle itself is Zelda's masterpiece of architectural storytelling. It's massive, complex, and entirely optional to explore thoroughly. Players can rush straight to Ganon if they want, but those who take time to explore find a complete history of the kingdom's fall. The castle has defensive positions that show where soldiers made their stands. It has libraries with books about the past. It has royal chambers that humanize the family that lived there. It has dungeons where the regime imprisoned its enemies. The environmental design makes the castle feel like a real place where real people lived and died, not just a video game level. The divine beasts also function as mobile architecture with distinct personalities. Varuta, the elephant, reflects Mipha's grace and the Zora's connection to water. Varudania, the salamander, embodies the Goron's relationship with heat and stone. Vamedo, the bird, soars with Rivali's arrogance. Varnaboris, the camel, channels Urbosa's fierce protection of her people. Each divine beast's interior tells an environmental story about its pilot through mechanical design and aesthetic choices. Elden Ring's architecture speaks a completely different language. Where Hyrule's buildings suggest aspiration, the Lands Between's architecture communicates domination and dread. Castles aren't just defensive, they're designed to intimidate. Towers aren't just tall, they're claustrophobically narrow or impossibly wide, playing with scale to make you feel small and wrong. Churches aren't sanctuaries, they're monuments to gods who either don't care or actively hate their worshippers. Stormvale Castle is architecture as accumulation and grafting, mirroring Godric's own body horror. The castle makes no logical sense as a defensive structure, because Godric kept adding to it without plan or purpose, grafting new sections onto old foundations until the whole thing became a labyrinth of terrified architectural choices. The environmental storytelling here is about a mind that couldn't accept limitation, that kept taking and adding and grafting until nothing made sense anymore. Raya Lucaria shows what happens when architecture serves obsession rather than people. The Academy's beautiful but hostile, its grand libraries and elegant spires hiding the fact that everyone inside has gone mad. The environmental design shows layers of construction and modification, as if each generation of scholars tried to perfect the space and just made it stranger. The final confrontation with Renala takes place in a library flooded with water, knowledge drowning in its own excess. Lindell, the capital, is perhaps the game's most complex architectural statement. It's enormous, golden, impossibly grand, and rotting at every foundation. The environmental storytelling here shows a civilization that built for eternity and discovered eternity is long enough to watch everything you build turn to ash. The city has layers: the surface streets where knights patrol, the underground where the omens were imprisoned, the roots where ancient civilizations still writhe. Each layer contradicts the others, showing that the Golden Order's perfection required burying everything imperfect beneath it. The minor dungeons scattered across the lands between, catacombs, caves, tunnels, all tell smaller environmental stories. Most are tombs that have been violated, either by grave robbers or by the dead themselves rising. The architecture is deliberately claustrophobic, pressing in on you, creating the sense that you're trespassing in spaces that don't want you there. Where Zelda's shrines feel like gifts left for you, Elden Ring's dungeons feel like places you've broken into, and the environment resents your presence. The game's approach to verticality also communicates its philosophy. In Breath of the Wild, height means perspective and beauty. The higher you climb, the more you can see and appreciate. In Elden Ring, height means dread and insignificance. Looking down from high places shows you how far you can fall. Looking up shows you how much further you have to climb, and how little your climbing matters against the scale of structures built by beings who could flatten you with a thought. Crumbling Farum Azula, the game's late area legacy dungeon, exists outside normal time and space. It's ancient beyond measure, literally crumbling into the void, and it was already ancient when Lendel was young. The architecture here is dragon scale and impossibility. Structures that shouldn't be able to stand, bridges that lead nowhere, spaces that connect to each other in ways that violate geometry. The environmental message is that even the oldest, greatest civilizations inevitably fall apart and time itself will eventually fail. The living presence or absence of people in these worlds profoundly affects their environmental storytelling. Both games feature sparse NPC populations relative to their enormous spaces, but they use this sparseness in opposite ways. Breath of the Wild's Hyrule feels empty in a peaceful way. The world ended a century ago, and what remains has had time to settle into quietness. The villages that still exist are small but stable. The travelling merchants, the wandering adventurers, the occasional hermit you meet on the road, all suggest that life continues even if it's more scattered than before. The emptiness feels like breathing room, like space for nature to reassert itself, like silence after a storm rather than the silence of a tomb. The game's NPCs, when you meet them, are generally helpful and hopeful. They've adapted to living in a diminished world. They tell stories about the past but also talk about their plans for the future. Stable owners maintain their businesses. Merchants travel dangerous roads. Researchers investigate ancient technology. Even characters with tragic backstories, like Cass searching for his teacher, or the various lovers separated by circumstance, frame their struggles as worth the effort. The environmental message is that people persist, that community matters, that trying is worthwhile even when the world is broken. The memories you recover show characters before the calamity, and they're dealing with very human problems. Zelda struggles with her powers and her place in the world. The champions worry about the coming battle. Link remains stoic. These aren't gods or demigods. They're people trying their best, and their best wasn't enough. But the game frames their trying as heroic rather than futile. The environmental storytelling around their memories, photos taken at specific locations, creates a connection between past and present, showing that remembering matters. The game also uses environmental absence effectively. Fields where people once lived now lie empty, but they're not haunted. They're just quiet. The ruins of ranches, military outposts, and residential areas tell stories through what's no longer there. But the absence feels like natural decay rather than violent erasure. Time has passed, and with time comes change, but change isn't necessarily malicious. Elden Ring takes the opposite approach. Its NPCs are few, scattered, and almost universally doomed. The lands between feel empty in a hostile way, as if the world itself is rejecting the presence of life. When you do meet people, they're often hollow, mad, or in the process of becoming something worse. The environmental storytelling is about isolation, about being fundamentally alone in a world that wants you dead. The Round Table Hold should be a sanctuary, a place where fellow tarnished gather in safety. But even there you can feel the decay. Characters disappear without explanation or betray you when the story demands it. The place itself exists in some liminal space, not quite real, accessed through grace rather than physical location. It's more a waiting room for the doomed than an actual community. The environmental design of the hold itself is spare and echoing, all stone and shadow and spaces that feel too empty. The game's few quest lines almost all end in death or transformation. You watch characters you've come to care about, Bled, Millicent, Alexander, reach the ends of their journeys and discover there was never any other option. The environmental storytelling positions their corpses as final statements, showing you exactly how they died, and making you understand that this was always where they were heading. FromSoftware doesn't let you save anyone. The world is too broken for that. The merchant NPCs in Elden Ring tell their own environmental story. They're members of a persecuted group who were buried alive beneath Lendel for the crime of heresy, basically for existing outside the Golden Order's control. When you find their mass grave, it's one of the game's most horrifying environmental revelations. These weren't soldiers or heretics or threats. They were travelling merchants who sold goods and played music, and the Golden Order decided they shouldn't exist. The environmental narrative is about what systems of power do to those who refuse to conform. The game also uses absence more aggressively than Zelda. Entire regions feel like they should have populations but don't. Liurnia has villages that are empty or hostile. Lendel is enormous but mostly abandoned, with just enough enemies to remind you that something terrible happened here. The mountaintops of the giants earned their name from a people who were genocided, and you walk through their ruins knowing that the Golden Order killed them all for the crime of having their own god. The absence isn't peaceful, it's accusatory. Even the game's boss arenas often tell environmental stories about absence. Radahn fights in a barren wasteland that used to be a festival ground. Mog's arena is hidden beneath the world in a palace built for a dynasty that will never exist. Malenia waits in the heart of a dying tree for a brother who's never coming back. The spaces where you fight these demigods are tombs, prisons, or monuments to failure, never places of actual power or life. This creates a fundamentally lonelier experience than Breath of the Wild. Link might be the last hero, but Hyrule still has people worth protecting. The Tarnished in Elden Ring is just another corpse that refuses to stay dead, wandering through a world that has no use for heroes anymore. The environmental storytelling constantly reinforces that you're too late, that whatever you're trying to save or fix is already gone, that your struggle is personally meaningful but cosmically pointless. Both games use item descriptions as crucial pieces of environmental storytelling, but they approach this technique with very different sensibilities. Breath of the Wild's item descriptions are generally straightforward and practical. A sword tells you its damage and durability, maybe includes a line about where it came from or who used it. A piece of armor describes its defensive properties and historical significance. The descriptions support environmental storytelling by providing context for objects you find, but they don't hide information or require deep interpretation. If you find a royal guard's weapon, the description tells you it belonged to elite soldiers who defended the castle. Clear, simple, respectful of player time. This approach fits Zelda's overall philosophy of accessibility and clarity. The game wants you to understand your tools and their history without requiring you to become a lore scholar. Item descriptions in Breath of the Wild function as supplementary information, adding flavour and context, but not hiding crucial narrative beats. You can engage as deeply as you want with this layer of storytelling, but you won't miss critical information if you just equip items based on stats and move on. The memory system provides the more substantial lore in Zelda, and even that's relatively direct. You find a location, trigger a memory, watch a cutscene that shows you exactly what happened there. The environmental storytelling is about placing these memories in their physical contexts, connecting narrative moments to geographical spaces, but the stories themselves aren't fragmented or obscure. Zelda tells you what you need to know. Elden Ring, true to FromSoftware tradition, uses item descriptions as archaeological fragments that players must assemble into coherent narratives. Every weapon, every piece of armor, every spell, every consumable comes with a description that provides exactly one piece of a much larger puzzle. Understanding what actually happened in the lands between requires collecting dozens of related items, reading all their descriptions, and figuring out how they connect. This creates a very different relationship with lore. Where Zelda's environmental storytelling is something you can appreciate while playing normally, Elden Ring's lore is something you excavate through dedicated effort. You find a sword that mentions a knight. Later you find that knight's armor, which mentions an order they belong to. Then you find a spell that order used, which mentions the god they served. Slowly, through accumulation, you piece together stories that the game never explicitly tells you. This fragmentary approach mirrors the game's themes perfectly. The lands between are broken, history is shattered, and understanding what happened requires assembling pieces from ruins scattered across an entire continent. The environmental storytelling technique matches the environmental reality. Just as you physically explore ruins to find items, you mentally explore lore to construct meaning. Both are acts of archaeological interpretation. The descriptions themselves often include ambiguous or poetic language that requires interpretation. An item might say something could imply a connection, or that it is said something happened. The game presents history the way history actually works, as incomplete records filtered through unreliable narrators with their own biases. Understanding the golden lineage requires reading items related to Godwyn, Morgott, Mog, Godric, and half a dozen other characters, then figuring out how they're all connected and why most of them are now horrible monsters. Some of the game's most important lore is hidden in consumable items. The literal god-killing weapon that enables several endings is described in the lore of unassuming items scattered across the world. The relationship between Marika and Radagon is hinted at in weapon descriptions, armor sets, and incantation texts. The true nature of the Elden Ring itself requires synthesizing information from dozens of sources. This isn't storytelling designed to be passively consumed. It's storytelling that demands active construction. The environmental aspect comes in where you find these items. A particular talisman in a specific location tells you something about who died there and why. A spell found in a hidden area reveals information about what that area was used for. The physical placement of items in the environment is itself a form of storytelling. When you find a knight's armor next to a dragon's corpse, you're reading an environmental story about their final battle without any text being necessary. This creates what could be called archaeological storytelling, where players literally dig through ruins to find fragments of history, then mentally excavate those fragments to construct narratives. It's labor-intensive, easily missed, and absolutely brilliant for players who engage with it. The satisfaction of finally understanding what happened to Godwyn, or why Radahn went mad, or what Marika actually wanted is immense precisely because you had to work for that understanding. The contrast here reveals something about what each game believes story should do in an open world. Zelda believes story should enhance exploration without gating it or making it inaccessible. You can finish the game understanding the basic narrative without reading every item or exploring every memory. Elden Ring believes story should be something you earn through dedication. That understanding should be a reward for players who care enough to dig through every description and connect every dot. Neither approach is objectively better. They serve different purposes. Zelda's method respects player time and makes the world broadly accessible. Elden Ring's method creates depth for dedicated players and a sense of mystery for everyone else. Both are forms of environmental storytelling, but one whispers the story as you pass by, while the other buries it in ruins and makes you excavate it yourself. The actual visual design of environments in these games communicates narrative through colour, lighting, weather, and spatial composition. Both games are masters of this technique, but they paint very different pictures. Breath of the Wild uses colour as a language of hope and natural beauty. The game's colour palette leans toward warm, saturated tones. Grass is a rich green, skies a brilliant blue, sunsets paint the world in gold and amber. Even dangerous areas have a kind of beauty to them. The volcanic slopes of Death Mountain glow with fierce orange light, and the frozen peaks of the Hebra region sparkle with pristine snow. The environmental message conveyed through colour is that this world, wounded as it is, remains beautiful and worth protecting. The game uses weather as environmental storytelling too. Rain makes climbing difficult, forcing players to seek shelter or change plans. Lightning strikes metal objects, teaching caution. Morning mist in valleys creates moments of quiet beauty. These weather systems make the world feel alive and dynamic rather than static. They also create variety in how the same locations feel at different times. Hyrule Field at dawn feels completely different from Hyrule Field during a thunderstorm, and both tell their own environmental stories about the relationship between land and sky. Lighting in Breath of the Wild is particularly masterful. The game uses golden hour lighting constantly, bathing ruins and landscapes in warm, nostalgic glow. This isn't realistic, it's mythic. It's the lighting of legend, of stories told around campfires, of memories softened by time. The environmental storytelling through light suggests that even tragedy can become beautiful with enough distance, that history transforms pain into something we can bear to remember. The spatial composition of Hyrule is also narratively significant. Important locations are visible from multiple vantage points. Hyrule Castle dominates the skyline, a constant reminder of your ultimate goal. The divine beasts are huge and obvious once activated, creating landmarks that help with navigation, while also serving as environmental storytelling. The design is saying, these things matter. These are the places history happened. These are what you're here to reclaim. The game also uses verticality as narrative. Revelation, climbing mountains reveals new regions, new shrines, new possibilities. The view from high places shows you how large and varied Hyrule is, how much there is to explore, how many stories wait to be discovered. Height in Zelda is rewarded with beauty and understanding, with a better perspective on the world and your place in it. Elden Ring's visual language communicates the opposite emotional reality. The colour palette is consistently muted, desaturated, tending toward grey, brown and sickly green. The sky is almost always overcast. Even in areas that should be vibrant, the Altus Plateau with its golden leaves or Liurnia with its lakes. The colours feel drained, exhausted, as if the world itself is running out of vitality. Based on what we know about the Lands Between's history, we can assume this visual design reflects the spiritual decay that followed the shattering. The game's weather is actively hostile. In Caelid, the air itself seems diseased. The mountaintops of the giants feature blizzards that limit visibility and drain health. The underground areas are either too dark or lit by things that shouldn't glow. Weather in Elden Ring isn't atmospheric beauty, it's environmental hazard. It reinforces that the world doesn't want you there, that existence itself has become difficult, that nature is no longer neutral but corrupted along with everything else. Lighting in Elden Ring is the lighting of decay. Most areas are dimly lit, requiring torches or lanterns. The light that does exist often comes from sickly sources, the pale glow of deathroot, the green luminescence of grave moss, the red emanation of scarlet rot. Even the Erd Tree, which should be a beacon of divine light, casts an exhausted golden glow that feels more like a dying candle than the sun. The environmental storytelling through light says that even the sources of illumination in this world are tainted, that nothing pure remains. The spatial composition of the lands between emphasizes scale and oppression. The Erd Tree looms over everything, too large to be comfortable, too bright to ignore. Castles are built to make you feel small. Cliffs drop away to crushing depths. The underground areas sprawl in ways that make you feel lost and insignificant. Where Zelda's landscapes invite exploration, Elden Ring's landscapes dare you to try. This could imply that the world itself has become antagonistic, that geography is no longer neutral ground but another enemy in a land defined by hostility. The game uses verticality as punishment rather than reward. Looking down shows you how far you'll fall if you make a mistake. Looking up shows you how much further you have to climb, how small you are compared to the structures around you, how insignificant your struggle is against beings who can reshape landscapes. Height doesn't grant beautiful vistas so much as reveal the extent of corruption, showing you region after region of decay stretching to every horizon. Visual motifs recur across the lands between to create thematic unity. Eyes appear everywhere, on spell effects, on buildings, on creatures. This could imply constant surveillance by the outer gods, the sense that something is always watching, that privacy and autonomy are illusions in a world where divine forces manipulate everything. Roots and tendrils invade architecture, not as gentle reclamation like in Zelda, but as parasitic invasion, suggesting that even the Erd Tree's influence is more infection than blessing. The game's approach to ruin design also differs significantly from Zelda. Where Breath of the Wild's ruins are weathered but structurally sound, Elden Ring's ruins are actively falling apart. Bridges collapse as you cross them. Towers lean at impossible angles. Floors give way beneath your feet. The environmental design treats decay as ongoing rather than historical. The world didn't just fall in the past, it's still falling right now, and you're walking through architecture that might finish collapsing at any moment. Color coding also serves environmental storytelling in Elden Ring. Gold is associated with the Golden Order and its lies. Red is scarlet rot, corruption, and Radaeon's affliction. Blue is associated with the moon and glintstone sorcery. Purple is death blight. Each color represents a different form of power, and all of them are dangerous. The environmental use of these colors tells you what kind of threat you're facing, what forces operate in each area, which faction or god has influence there. Both games use visual language masterfully, but they're speaking different languages. Zelda's environmental visuals say, "This world was beautiful, was wounded, and can be beautiful again." Elden Ring's environmental visuals say, "This world was always broken, the beauty was a lie, and decay is the only truth left." One invites you to appreciate natural splendor, the other forces you to confront unnatural horror. Both are effective environmental storytelling, just pointed in opposite emotional directions. The way combat and mechanical systems work in these games also functions as environmental storytelling, communicating themes and philosophy through gameplay rather than text or visuals. Breath of the Wild's combat is flexible and creative. You can approach most encounters multiple ways. Stealth around enemies, fight them directly, use the environment against them. The weapon variety encourages experimentation, and while weapon durability is controversial, it forces you to adapt and try new things rather than settling into comfortable patterns. This mechanical flexibility is itself environmental storytelling. It says the world is full of possibilities, that creativity is rewarded, that there's always another approach if the first one doesn't work. The game's difficulty curve is also narratively meaningful. The plateau teaches you basics, then releases you into a world where you decide how much challenge you want. Want to fight Linnels immediately? You can try, though you'll probably die. Want to explore peacefully and avoid combat? That's valid too. The mechanical message is about player agency and choice, about respecting different playstyles and skill levels. The environmental design supports this by creating spaces where combat is optional, where you can see enemies from a distance and decide whether to engage. The cooking system also serves as mechanical storytelling. Gathering ingredients, experimenting with recipes, preparing food before difficult challenges, this creates a rhythm of preparation and action that makes you feel like a hero preparing for adventure rather than a murder machine cutting through respawning enemies. The environmental storytelling comes through how ingredients are placed in the world, how you learn which areas have which resources, how different climates require different preparations. The rune abilities, bombs, stasis, magnesis, cryonis, are tools for interacting with the environment in creative ways. They're not just combat skills, they're puzzle solutions, exploration aids, and toys for experimentation. The mechanical design says the world is a playground as much as a battlefield, that your relationship with the environment should be curious and playful, rather than purely hostile. This reinforces the game's overall theme of adventure and discovery. Elden Ring's combat tells a much darker story. The game is brutally difficult by design, and that difficulty is narrative. It says that everything in the lands between wants you dead, that survival requires not just skill but willingness to die repeatedly and learn from failure. Death isn't punishment in Elden Ring, it's the primary teaching method. The mechanical experience of dying to the same boss 20 times before finally winning is itself environmental storytelling about the nature of the world you're in. The game's combat is methodical and punishing. Enemies hit hard. Mistakes are costly. Pattern recognition and patience matter more than reflexes. This could imply a world where carelessness kills, where the corruption has made everything more dangerous, where even basic survival requires constant vigilance. The mechanical difficulty reinforces the environmental narrative of hostility. The game is telling you, through gameplay, that the lands between are not on your side. The status effects in Elden Ring also function as mechanical environmental storytelling. Scarlet rot builds up and kills you slowly, mirroring the way millennia's influence corrupts entire regions. Madness manifests as grabbing at your own head and screaming, showing what happens to minds that can't handle the truth of the outer gods. Deathblight causes instant death, as death itself grows on your body like a tumor. These aren't just gameplay challenges, they're mechanical representations of how different forces corrupt and destroy. The game's approach to resources also tells a story. Healing flasks are limited and precious. Leveling up requires accumulated runes that you lose when you die. Powerful items are rare and often require extensive exploration to find. The mechanical scarcity reinforces themes of desperation and struggle. You're not an empowered hero with unlimited resources, you're barely scraping by, making every victory feel hard-earned because it was. Boss design in Elden Ring is particularly effective as mechanical storytelling. Each major boss has a moveset and arena that reflects their lore and character. Radahn's massive attacks mirror his legendary strength, and the fact that he's lost his mind means his patterns are aggressive and uncontrolled. Millennia, the game's most infamous boss, is both impossibly graceful and devastatingly deadly, mechanical representation of her identity as an undefeated swordswoman who's also rotting from the inside out. The Spirit Ash system provides mechanical commentary on the game's themes. You can summon copies of enemies you've defeated, bringing allies to fights, but they're just spirits, echoes of the dead, temporary companions in a world where everything permanent has already failed. This could imply that even your allies are really just more corpses, that the distinction between friend and enemy matters less than the distinction between still animated and finally still, the multiplayer. Systems also serve as mechanical environmental storytelling. You can summon help, but doing so requires items and enables invasion. You can invade others, hunting them as a hostile presence. Even cooperation is tinged with threat in the lands between. Messages left by other players can help or mislead. Bloodstains show you where others died, but don't tell you how to avoid the same fate. The mechanical systems say that even when humans cooperate, it's temporary, conditional, and always shadowed by the possibility of betrayal. Both games use mechanics as storytelling, but they tell opposite stories. Zelda's mechanics say, you're capable, creative, and the world wants you to succeed. Elden Ring's mechanics say, you're small, fragile, and the world wants you to fail. One empowers through flexibility. The other tests through brutality. Both are valid approaches to mechanical storytelling, communicating theme through the physical experience of playing rather than through narrative exposition. The amount of guidance and interpretive freedom each game offers represents a core philosophical difference in how they respect player agency and storytelling ambition. Breath of the Wild values player freedom enormously. After the initial plateau tutorial, the game gives you a goal, defeat Ganon, and says, figure out how to get there. You can go straight to the castle if you want, though you'll probably die. More likely you'll explore, build strength, recover memories, complete shrines, and gradually become capable enough to face the final challenge. But the order is entirely up to you. Want to do all the divine beasts first? That's one approach. Want to skip them entirely? That's also valid. This freedom is carefully structured. The game guides you subtly through environmental design. Interesting landmarks pull your attention. Paths lead somewhere worth going. Shrines glow visibly at night. The design creates natural flows that encourage exploration without forcing specific routes. This could be seen as respecting player autonomy, while also ensuring players don't get completely lost. The environmental storytelling is accessible because the game wants everyone to experience it, not just players who happen to explore in the right order. The memory system also offers player agency. You can recover all of them or none of them. You can find them in order or completely randomly. The story they tell is the same either way, but how you experience that story depends entirely on your exploration choices. Finding Memory 17 before Memory 1 gives you a completely different emotional arc than experiencing them sequentially. The game allows this, trusts you to construct meaning from fragments in whatever order you find them. Zelda also offers explicit guidance for players who want it. Quest markers exist. NPCs give you directions. The main quest is clearly marked. The game doesn't force you to follow these guides, but it offers them for players who prefer structure. This creates a spectrum of player agency. You can play completely freely, use some guidance, or follow directions closely depending on your preference. The environmental storytelling remains accessible across this spectrum. Elden Ring takes a very different approach. The game gives you almost no guidance. Grace sites point you in a vague direction, but following them is optional. NPCs give cryptic hints or no hints at all. Quest progression is often obscure, requiring you to remember details from conversations had hours ago and figure out where to apply that information. The game trusts, or maybe demands, that players will explore extensively, talk to everyone, pay attention to every detail, and still probably miss most of the content on their first playthrough. This lack of guidance is itself a form of environmental storytelling. It says the lands between don't care about you, that you're not special enough to deserve a clear path, that figuring things out is your problem. The world doesn't owe you explanations or directions. This can be frustrating, but it also creates a genuine sense of discovery when you do figure something out. Finding a hidden area by noticing a suspicious wall, or understanding what an NPC's cryptic directions meant, feels like actual detective work rather than following waypoints. The game's multiple endings also require extensive exploration and specific questline completions to access. Most players will get the default ending, which is appropriately bleak. To see other endings requires following complex NPC questlines, finding hidden areas, making specific choices at specific times. These endings aren't presented as options. You have to discover that they exist and figure out how to trigger them. This could imply that even transcending the default fate of the lands between requires exceptional effort and understanding. The interpretive freedom Elden Ring offers is more extreme than Zelda's. The game's fragmented storytelling means that understanding what actually happened requires players to construct their own interpretations from incomplete evidence. Did Marika want the Elden Ring shattered, or was she forced? What was Radagon's role? Why did Godwyn have to die? The game provides clues but not answers, and different players construct different narratives from the same evidence. This creates a community of interpretation, where players share theories, debate lore, and collectively try to understand what FromSoftware is saying through environmental clues and item descriptions. The lack of explicit explanation becomes generative, spawning thousands of discussions and theories. The environmental storytelling is effective precisely because it's ambiguous, because it requires active interpretation, because no two players see exactly the same story. Both approaches to player agency have strengths. Zelda's guided freedom ensures more players experience the environmental storytelling without getting lost or frustrated. Elden Ring's radical freedom creates deeper engagement for dedicated players, but risks alienating those who prefer clearer direction. Zelda says, "We want everyone to see what we built." Elden Ring says, "We want those who care enough to dig for what we buried." The question isn't which approach is better, but what each game values. Zelda values accessibility and broad appeal. It wants as many players as possible to feel the satisfaction of exploration and discovery. Elden Ring values depth and dedication. It wants players who finish it to feel they've earned their understanding, that they've genuinely explored rather than been given a tour. Both are valid forms of environmental storytelling, just aimed at different audiences with different expectations. These two games have had profound effects on how other developers think about environmental storytelling and open-world design. Breath of the Wild's influence is immediately visible across modern gaming. Its approach to environmental storytelling, clear but subtle, guided but free, has become a template for accessible open-world design. Games like Genshin Impact, Immortals Phoenix Rising, and even God of War 2018 show clear inspiration from how Zelda balances player freedom with environmental narrative. The idea that you can create massive worlds that tell stories through landscape without requiring explicit quest markers or constant exposition has become mainstream, largely because Zelda proved it could work at scale. The game's approach to minimal UI and natural exploration has influenced everything from Horizon Forbidden West to Ghost of Tsushima. The idea that the world itself should guide players rather than waypoints and objective markers, that visual design should communicate where to go and what matters, this philosophy is now common in AAA game development. Zelda demonstrated that players don't need their hands held as tightly as many developers assumed, that environmental design can do much of the work that UI used to handle. The game's influence extends to how studios think about post-apocalyptic settings. Where many games before Breath of the Wild presented apocalypse as grim and hostile, Zelda showed that destroyed worlds can also be beautiful, hopeful, and worth exploring for reasons beyond just looting resources. This hasn't replaced darker post-apocalyptic aesthetics, but it has expanded the emotional palette available to developers working with ruined worlds. Elden Ring's influence is different but equally significant. The game proved that FromSoftware's hardcore approach to difficulty and environmental storytelling could work in an open-world context. Many developers assumed that open worlds needed to be more accessible, that the kind of punishing challenge and obscure lore delivery From Software was famous for couldn't scale to larger spaces. Elden Ring demonstrated otherwise, becoming one of the best-selling games in years while refusing to compromise on its demanding philosophy. The game's approach to environmental storytelling through item descriptions and fragmented narrative has influenced how other developers think about lore delivery. You see echoes of this in games like Lees of Piss or Lords of the Fallen, but also in unexpected places. Even games that don't adopt FromSoftware's full difficulty ethos are experimenting with more fragmented archaeological approaches to storytelling, where players construct narratives from environmental clues rather than being told everything explicitly. Elden Ring has also influenced how developers think about player agency and guidance. The game's success, despite or because of its refusal to hold players' hands, has given other studios confidence to reduce explicit guidance in their own titles. There's a growing understanding that some players actively prefer to figure things out themselves, that discovery feels more rewarding when it's genuinely earned, rather than delivered through quest markers and tutorial prompts. The contrast between these two approaches has created a useful spectrum for developers to position their own environmental storytelling. You don't have to choose between Zelda's accessibility and Elden Ring's opacity. You can position anywhere along that spectrum depending on your goals and audience. Want broad appeal? Move towards Zelda's model. Want dedicated community engagement? Move toward Elden Ring's model. Most games will land somewhere in between, taking lessons from both. Both games have also influenced how players think about and discuss environmental storytelling. There are now communities dedicated to excavating every environmental detail, to understanding how architecture and item placement communicate narrative, to appreciating the craft that goes into telling stories without words. Players have become more sophisticated readers of environmental narrative, more willing to engage with subtle storytelling, more appreciative of games that trust their intelligence. The future of environmental storytelling in games will almost certainly draw from both these giants. We'll see games that try to marry Zelda's accessibility with Elden Ring's depth, that create worlds beautiful enough to invite exploration while mysterious enough to reward dedicated attention. We'll see developers experimenting with different points on the spectrum between explicit and implicit storytelling, between guided and unguided exploration. What both games have proven is that environmental storytelling, when done masterfully, can be just as emotionally powerful as traditional narrative while offering unique advantages. It creates player agency in narrative comprehension. It rewards exploration and attention. It makes worlds feel genuinely inhabited and historical, rather than obviously constructed as game levels, and it respects players enough to believe they'll engage with stories that don't spell everything out. Elden Ring and The Legend of Zelda represent two complete, opposed philosophies about what ruins should teach us, and how fantasy worlds should frame destruction and hope. Both are masters of environmental storytelling, but they use their mastery to create entirely different emotional experiences. Zelda says, "The world was good, evil destroyed it, but goodness persists and can triumph again." Its environmental storytelling communicates resilience, the possibility of renewal, the idea that even when everything falls apart, the pieces can be gathered and rebuilt. Its ruins are peaceful, its landscapes beautiful, its NPCs hopeful. The adventure it offers is fundamentally optimistic, framing exploration as an act of reclamation and heroism, as choosing to try even when trying seems impossible. Elden Ring says, "The world was always broken. Goodness was a lie told by corrupt powers, and your struggle is personally meaningful but cosmically futile." Its environmental storytelling communicates decay, the impossibility of fixing what's fundamentally corrupted, the idea that when things fall apart, the pieces don't fit back together. Its ruins are hostile, its landscapes diseased, its NPCs doomed. The adventure it offers is fundamentally pessimistic, framing exploration as witnessing, atrocity and heroism as continuing anyway despite knowing it won't matter. Neither of these philosophies is objectively correct. They're fantasy games. They can be whatever their creators want them to be. What matters is how thoroughly and effectively each game commits to its philosophy, how every environmental detail reinforces the emotional reality it's trying to create. Zelda commits completely to hopeful discovery. Every system, every visual choice, every narrative decision points toward the idea that adventure is worthwhile, that exploring is rewarding, that broken things can be fixed if you're willing to try. The environmental storytelling never undercuts this optimism. Even the game's saddest moments, Zelda crying in Link's arms, the champions dying in their divine beasts, the kingdom falling, are framed as tragic but not nihilistic. They're losses that give meaning to eventual victory, not proof that victory is impossible. Elden Ring commits just as completely to tragic revelation. Every system, every visual choice, every narrative decision points toward the idea that power corrupts, that civilizations rot from within, that the distinction between hero and villain is less clear than we'd like. The environmental storytelling never offers false hope. Even the game's few moments of beauty, Ranni's questline offering a different path, Millicent, choosing her own fate, Alexander dying with dignity, are tinged with awareness that the lands between as a whole are beyond saving. What makes these games remarkable isn't that they tell different stories, it's that they tell those stories so thoroughly through environment rather than exposition. You don't need cutscenes to understand Zelda's optimism or Elden Ring's pessimism. You feel it in how the light falls, how architecture shapes space, how ruins speak about the people who built them, how colour and weather and enemy placement combine to create emotional reality. They prove that environmental storytelling can carry complete philosophical positions, can communicate worldviews and emotional truths through nothing more than careful design and trust in player attention. They show that show don't tell isn't just a technique for individual scenes, but a comprehensive approach to narrative that can sustain entire massive worlds. For players, these games offer different but equally valid experiences. If you need to believe in hope, if you need adventure to feel like discovery and heroism to feel meaningful, Hyrule is there for you. If you need to confront darker truths about power and corruption, if you need to see decay honestly portrayed, if you want to choose to continue fighting even when fighting seems pointless, the lands between await. For designers, these games are masterclasses in how environmental storytelling operates at scale. They're case studies in committing completely to a vision, in trusting players to engage with subtle narrative, in understanding that the emotional reality of a world matters more than its lore complexity. They prove that you can tell profound stories through landscape, and that different landscapes tell different stories about what it means to be human, to struggle, to explore, to make meaning from ruins. The space between these two approaches is where most games will exist, pulling elements from both philosophies to create their own environmental stories. But having these two giants at opposite ends of the spectrum, Zelda's bright hope and Elden Ring's dark tragedy, gives the entire medium clearer understanding of what's possible when you let worlds tell their own stories. When you trust that a thoughtfully designed ruin can communicate more about history than any history book. When you believe that players will pay attention if you give them something worth seeing. These are two different answers to the same question. What do ruins tell us about ourselves? Zelda says they tell us we can rebuild. Elden Ring says they tell us we'll fail again. Both answers are true in their own contexts. Both are powerfully communicated through environmental design, and both remind us that the spaces we create in games can speak as eloquently as any dialogue or cutscene. The comparison reveals something fundamental about interactive storytelling. The same medium, open-world action RPG with environmental narrative focus, can create completely opposite emotional experiences through nothing more than design choices about color, light, architecture, item placement, and how much guidance to provide. The tools are the same. The vision determines everything. In the end, both games are generous in their own ways. Zelda is generous with hope, with beauty, with the suggestion that your efforts matter and will be rewarded. Elden Ring is generous with truth, with complexity, with the suggestion that the real world is broken too and fantasy shouldn't hide that. Both forms of generosity are valuable. Both create spaces where players can explore not just virtual landscapes, but emotional and philosophical territories. The environmental storytelling in these games does what the best environmental storytelling always does. It makes you slow down, pay attention, and think about why things are shaped the way they are. It rewards curiosity. It respects intelligence. It trusts that showing is more powerful than telling. And it proves that game worlds, when crafted with care and purpose, can speak to us as directly as any book or film or painting, can move us and challenge us and stay with us long after we've put down the controller. Two worlds. Two philosophies. One truth. When games learn to let their environments tell stories, when they trust that ruins and rubble and the shape of roads can carry meaning, they become something more than entertainment. They become spaces where we can explore what we believe about hope and despair, about trying and failing, about whether broken things deserve our attention. And in that exploration we learn something about ourselves and what stories we need to hear.